In this video, we're going to be talking about the news that Geoffrey Paschel has just been convicted of domestic abuse and faces up to 30 years in jail. So I'm going to look at what came to light during the trial, all of the arguments and evidence, and then I'm going to talk about what you can expect next. So as you may know, Geoffrey was accused of attacking his ex, Kristen Wilson, in June 2019. The pair had been in an on-off relationship for a number of years, at one point breaking up because apparently Geoffrey didn't want to be in a monogamous relationship, and given that he's apparently slept with over 500 women, that kind of suggests that he's not really too hot on serious relationships. However, at the time of the incident, Kristen and Geoffrey were actually engaged to be married. She was his fiancée. He'd proposed to her just 3 months before the night in question. But by the sounds of things, their relationship was full of secrets. She claims, for example, that for a long time she didn't even know that he had kids, or that he'd had 4 failed marriages. Sound familiar? Yeah, he did exactly the same thing on the show with Varya too.
Why did you tell me when we started our conversation you have no kids?
Now let's get to the trial itself. In the early hours of the morning of June the 9th, 2019, police were called to Kristen's neighbour's house. When they arrived, body cam footage shows that the police found Kristen crawled up on the floor of her neighbour's kitchen. She had a huge lump on her forehead, bruises all over her body, and cuts on her elbows and her knees. And in the days after the incident, some of those bruises developed into 2 black eyes. According to the paramedic that treated her on the scene, she also showed signs of concussion. Kristen told police that her injuries were caused by Geoffrey. Now, due to the graphic nature of this crime, I've decided I don't want to be showing these horrific photos, but if you do want to see them, I'll leave links in my description where you can find them. So what actually happened that night? Well, let me go through both versions of events so you can understand what they were both arguing about in the trial. Kristen claims they went to a restaurant for dinner, and over the course of many hours, they dispute how many hours they were there, but anywhere from 2 to 5 hours, she drank 3 glasses of champagne. She says she was totally sober, but that Geoffrey was drunk. He was apparently drinking double whiskey and cokes all night. She then drove them back to her house, and the plan was for them to get ready because they were going to go back out to meet up with one of her friends. Now, while Geoffrey was in the house, she says she let her dog out, and while outside she sent a message to her friend to let her know that they were just about to set off. She then walked back into her own home, and the next thing she remembers is when she regained consciousness, she was on the floor being beaten by Geoffrey.
And he had me by the back of my head and was hitting my face into the floor, and I was screaming for him to stop.
Next, he dragged her by her hair up a small flight of steps, and then she lost consciousness again. When she regained consciousness, she says that Geoffrey took away her phone and her keys, led her into the bathroom, refusing to turn on the light so that she couldn't see her own face, and then ordered her to wash her face and go to bed. And she did what she was told. She would have done literally anything just to stop that torment and that abuse. Now, when she was lying in bed, he apparently went through her phone and her laptop and deleted any text messages or voicemails that he'd ever sent her. And he also deleted most of the photos of the pair of them. Now, that photo part is quite important. You'll see why shortly. So while Geoffrey was deleting everything, Kristen says that she was pretending to be asleep, but occasionally she'd peek and see what he was doing. Honestly, I can't even imagine how horrific this whole ordeal must have been. How terrified the poor lady must have been. And also, how confused she must have been, because apparently she says this was a totally unprovoked attack. They hadn't even been arguing that night. It was just a total random act of violence. Now, get this. When Geoffrey finished deleting everything from her phone, he then climbed into bed with her, and eventually he fell asleep. And that's when she seized her opportunity and ran out of the house, barefoot, to her neighbour's house. And of course, that's when the police were called. When the police came, Kristen was taken to hospital, and the police then went to her house where they found a half-naked Geoffrey and they arrested him. Keep in mind, according to the legal commentators, Kristen was a very good witness. She was calm, she explained her version of events very clearly, and you could also tell just from her general demeanour that she still genuinely seemed fearful of Geoffrey. And the impact of her being on the stand shouldn't be underestimated. It's a lot more powerful for jurors to see her in person, hear her jaw-dropping testimony and see how she's still scared of him, compared to, for example, what happens in many domestic abuse cases where the abused partner just doesn't take the stand. So this made things a lot more real for the jurors. Okay, so now that we've heard Kristen's version of events, let's now compare that to what Geoffrey and his attorneys say happened. So Geoffrey denies ever hitting Kristen. He says all of her injuries were self-inflicted. So he agrees that they went to a restaurant that night, but he claims Kristen drank way more than just 3 glasses of champagne. He claims she'd actually been drinking at the same pace that he'd been drinking, and that she'd had champagne, martinis, and also Tito soda limes. He also claims that the server at the restaurant was Kristen's brother's girlfriend, so a close friend of Kristen's, and as such, his argument is the drinks they were being served were actually very strong, way stronger than other guests would have been having. But, crucially, although his whole argument basically centres around the fact that Kristen was drunk, he has no receipts, he has no CCTV footage or basically anything to support the claim that she was stumbling or she was intoxicated. And he also doesn't dispute the fact that, despite claiming that she was drunk, she actually drove them home. Now, when they got back to her house, this is where their version of events really starts to differ. Whereas Kristen claims that she took her dog out, Geoffrey claims he was the one that took her dog out, and that while he was outside, he apparently had a phone call with his son. And he says when Kristen saw him on his phone, she flipped out, thinking that he was talking to another woman. And when he came back inside, they had an argument. That's apparently when she scratched him. Now, he did have scratch marks on his body, and they actually turn out to be quite important in the trial, so I'll come back to those shortly. But going back to the argument that Geoffrey had over the phone call, Geoffrey says Kristen tried to run out of the house, but in her intoxicated state, she tripped over and hit her head, leaving a mark and some blood on her face. Then, he says, he took her to the bathroom to wash up and calm down, and they both apparently went to bed. At some point during the night, he claims she got out of bed and while stumbling around drunk, she walked into the wall.
The point on the wall where she had ran into the wall. I mean, we were both drunk, as I said. She bounced around the wall, and that was one part of the wall where she come down the stairs and I bumped into.
Yep, the good old she walked into the wall defense. Yeah, so at this point, Geoffrey says he asked her what she was doing, and when Kristen said that she was going to call the cops, he decided that because he hadn't done anything wrong in his mind, he had nothing to hide, he was just going to stay at her house. And that's obviously where the police found him when they came to arrest him. Once arrested, and in the back of a police car, Geoffrey apparently became very aggressive and he attempted to kick out the windows of the police car. Now, for some reason, before the trial began, they actually dropped the vandalism charge that he'd initially been facing relating to that exact incident, trying to kick out the windows of the cop car. And I'm not really sure why, because I would have thought that the body cam footage of the police officers would have had all of that recorded. If you have any ideas why they didn't try Geoffrey for vandalism as well, or if you can shed any light on any of that, please leave a comment down below. I'm very, very keen to know about that because I would have thought that would have been an easy conviction. But anyway, that was basically the basis of Geoffrey's defence. He denies ever hitting Kristen and he denies ever deleting anything from her phone or her laptop. His attorney argued that if, as she claimed, he'd been beating her for 30 to 40 minutes, she'd have had many broken bones. Which begs the question, why would Kristen make it all up? Well, Geoffrey's defence tried to imply that she was making it all up out of spite, to get back at him. You see, he says Kristen sent him a number of text messages over the course of several months immediately after the night in question. And in these messages, he says Kristen first started off being nice and telling him how she missed him, but when he refused to reply to any of them, she apparently got more and more angry eventually texting him to say she'll do anything she can to make sure he loses custody of one of his sons. At the time, Geoffrey was indeed in a custody battle over his 4-year-old son with one of his ex-wives. Now, you'd have thought that if Geoffrey had such damning text messages of Kristen saying that she's going to go out of her way to make him lose custody of his kids, he'd be able to show them in court, right? Well, he claims that he deleted the original text messages from his phone, but conveniently, he apparently had screenshots of those messages. Now, the state prosecutors outright reject that Kristen had sent those messages, and they accuse Geoffrey of just faking them. Kristen actually agreed to have her phone and her iCloud subpoenaed, but a forensic download wasn't able to prove if such texts ever existed. But at the same time, they also couldn't prove that they didn't exist. So what did the jury find? Well, after hearing all of the evidence and cross-examination, which lasted for 2 days, they deliberated for an hour and 49 minutes, and then they found Geoffrey guilty on all 3 counts that he was being tried for: aggravated kidnapping, domestic violence, and interfering with an emergency call. And as I say, the 4th charge of vandalism was actually dropped before the trial began. Geoffrey was taken into custody and he'll remain there until his sentencing, which is scheduled to take place on December the 3rd, 2021. He's facing anywhere from 8 to 30 years in prison. But here's the thing, there's been a lot of criticism of the trial, and it's highly likely that there's going to be an appeal. So let me quickly explain where the criticism and the controversy lies. Remember how I said Geoffrey was found with scratches on his body? Well, when on the stand, the arresting officer made a statement saying he believed the scratches were self-inflicted and that they weren't caused by Kristen. Now, that statement was ruled to be inadmissible because that was just the arresting officer's personal opinion. It was speculation. He's not an expert witness. He doesn't have the expertise to conclusively say that Geoffrey scratched himself. And so the jury were advised to ignore that comment. Now, on appeal, it's highly likely that Geoffrey's attorneys will argue this comment from a cop, a person in authority, was enough to unfairly influence the jury's thinking. And then there was the issue which threatened the entire trial. It nearly caused a mistrial. Let me explain. So when Kristen was being asked about the photos that she says Geoffrey deleted from her phone, she revealed that some of the photos he deleted were of injuries she'd suffered from other times Geoffrey had allegedly abused her. But that should not have been brought up. The prosecution and defence apparently both agreed that if Geoffrey agreed to take to the stand and testify, which he did, then any discussions about previous abuse by Geoffrey, including previous convictions for abuse, would not be brought up. And Kristen herself knew that she shouldn't have mentioned anything about that previous abuse. She even said, quote, "I don't know if I can talk about this," but then she went on to say it anyway. So by making the jury aware of that previous abuse, Geoffrey's attorney argued she was unfairly influencing the jury, and not only that, they also claimed that this was done at a very strategic point in the trial, just as the trial was finishing up, at a point where Geoffrey's attorney wasn't allowed to cross-examine her about it. As a result, they requested a mistrial, which basically means they wanted the entire trial to be invalid and thrown out. But the judge instead just asked the jury to disregard that statement. Now, again, on appeal, it's highly likely that Geoffrey's defence team will try to claim that by mentioning that previous abuse, again the jury were being unfairly influenced, thereby, they'll claim, coming to the wrong conclusion. What's really ironic about all of this, and what actually gives you such a great insight into just how narcissistic Geoffrey is that he apparently rejected a plea deal before the case started, which would have involved him admitting his guilt but not serving any jail time. Instead of accepting it, he was determined to go to trial. He wanted his day in court, he wanted the limelight, and it's come back to bite him. Now, some might say, well, hold on a minute, if he was so keen to go to trial when he could have just walked away scot-free, surely that implies that he's innocent. But as this legal expert says, it's more to do with the fact that Geoffrey was convinced the jury would believe him and like him more than they'd like Kristen.
This is a guy who likes the spotlight. My opinion is that Mr. Paschel thinks he can make a better connection with the jury, that he thinks that his story will be the one that's believed.
This is a man who has such a high opinion of himself that he's convinced he'll be able to charm the jurors and get them on side. He could have accepted the plea deal and he could have walked away with no jail time, and according to these legal experts, almost every attorney would have advised him to do that. But now he's been found guilty and he's facing up to 30 years. As for where this leaves us now, the fallout of all of this, well, the whole thing is incredibly shocking and it raises a lot of questions about how Geoffrey was ever allowed to appear on 90 Day Fiancé in the first place. Remember, all of this took place before he even appeared on the show, so why TLC thought it was a good idea to air his segment is beyond me. And even before this conviction, you might say, well, innocent until proven guilty. Fine, but even before this conviction, he's had lots of previous convictions ranging from theft and drugs to several other accusations and charges of sexual assault and even rape. I mean, look, another ex-girlfriend, one from 2011, even has an order of protection against him. So yeah, TLC have a lot to answer for. In the aftermath of the verdict, there was a lot of people taking to social media to backtrack. Many of Geoffrey's previous friends came out and spoke about how they were only friends with him because he was innocent until proven guilty. But yeah, conveniently they all overlooked the fact that this is a guy who's been guilty lots of times in the past. He seems like a really nasty piece of work. Now, there was something very interesting that happened at the end of the trial, just as he was being led away. Geoffrey took off a wedding ring and handed it to Mary. Yeah, that Mary. She appeared to be the only lady who was there supporting him. Varya, despite being in the States, was not present in the courtroom, even though it's rumoured he and Varya may actually be married. And in fact, Varya may even be pregnant. If you haven't seen my recent video about all of that drama, I'll leave a link for you to check out now. Watch that next. Now, don't forget, leave your comments down below, and if you haven't already done so, hit the like button, hit that subscribe button for lots more 90 Day Fiancé videos. Thank you for watching, catch you on the next video.